You must do it now! You must pray!
I can't!
You must, or he won't die!
You pray, you're a priest! You pray, you pray!
He won't die! He isn't going to die!
Well, hello there. It is that time of year again. One that quite a few people look forward to. Up here in the north, crisp fall weather has settled in, and that means Halloween is just around the corner. Every year, I do something that I'm sure many of you probably also do, and that is to run a Halloween-themed or horror one-shot adventure, or maybe even a mini-campaign. I've always felt that horror can be a very impactful RPG experience. In fact, I did a recent video on how I got hooked on RPGs for life, and it wasn't through D&D. It was actually a Call of Cthulhu game when I was just 13 years old. But I've also felt that if you overdo horror, maybe do it week after week after week, it kind of loses its impact. And that's why a once-a-year game for us is just about perfect. I figured I would give you a few insights that I've developed over the years that I've discovered after running these types of games. And I highly encourage you to try these one-shots, especially, but not exclusively, around this time of year. You can do them whenever the mood strikes. Now, when I run our once-a-year horror-themed game, I do it on the Friday before Halloween, which has now become kind of a tradition at the table, one that the group and I very much look forward to. I mentally block off that we will need about 4 hours of gaming. This is usually just about right for a tight, but still kind of complex adventure, which may throw a twist or two at the players. That probably means you want to block off about 4.5 or 5 hours for arrival, explanation, maybe a mid-session break if necessary. Now, this may sound like a convention game, especially for those of you that have run those, and in some ways you can kind of treat it as such. I'd highly encourage you to kind of even change the seating order at the table if you have one. Get the players out of their comfort zone just a little bit. And now comes the question of what rule set should you use for this type of adventure? That, of course, is ultimately up to you. But I would encourage you to pick one that is pretty easy to grasp and be ready to modify it if necessary. The last thing you want in a game where you're trying to scare the dickens out of the players is a bunch of rules questions to slow things down to a crawl. Over the years, I found that Call of Cthulhu, the traditional Call of Cthulhu game, works well because it has a very intuitive percentage system. It's very easy to play on a technical level and also to grasp for the players to kind of see what their strengths and weaknesses are. And speaking of characters, in case you haven't guessed, you should probably always have pre-generated characters for these types of games, but do allow the players to modify them if they so wish. Call of Cthulhu is always a good choice here, even if you're not using the Cthulhu mythos as the basis for your adventure. It was the one I used last year when I ran a group through an adventure based on the film The Devil Rides Out. In this adventure, the villains were actually just a group of Satanists around the turn of the 20th century England. Trail of Cthulhu is also a fair choice here. It actually has a really good rule set for discovering clues, but I found that things like combat and physical actions in that game are a tad lackluster, but they do get the job done. I did an adventure in the Trail of Cthulhu rule set, I think it was 3 years ago, from their Shadows over Filmland adventure collection. It was kind of similar to the old Blood Brothers series for the original Call of Cthulhu line, if you remember those, based more on like film and literature, rather than strictly mythos. Now, the adventure I did was inspired by the beautiful 1940s noir horror films of Val Lewton. It kind of suggested the supernatural, but in the end, had an all-too-human group of adversaries. You can also use any form of universal rule set, like Savage Worlds. Some time ago, I did a Hammer horror homage using the Quags, that's quick-ass game system rules, which are mostly designed just for convention use. But the rules work great here. Kind of boiled the characters down to their bare essence. And my group had a grand time overcoming the vampire baron von Meister. So simpler is usually better. Also, it's important that no matter what rule set you use, you make sure to realize that you're telling a story in one night. That means that you shouldn't be afraid to modify the rules, especially when it comes to physical and mental healing. Let everyone know upfront that if they're injured, chances are their character may stay injured unless the adventure has a larger timeline arc. You also want to be aware of pacing when you're running a horror one-shot. Just like in normal games, you never want to railroad or allow the PCs to think that they have no agency. Indeed, you should be very flexible. But if there is a key bit of information the PCs need to discover to go on to a deeper secret, you need to be willing and also have the skill to allow that information to be discovered in several different ways. Alternatively, if the PCs are onto something earlier than you expected, you're just going to have to adjust. Don't penalize them by denying them the thrill of bagging your main bad guy earlier than expected. You're just going to have to adapt a little bit and maybe put over his number two, or perhaps introduce a shadowy, unseen villain who's really pulling the strings. Also, don't be afraid to take a player into confidence beforehand if you need a traitor in the group. Now, obviously, pick someone who you can trust to roleplay without having a tell, and also someone who doesn't mind having a bit of the story spoiled for the fun of working in league with the DM. I wouldn't overdo something like this. I wouldn't do it all the time. But in the right adventure, it could be something your group remembers for years to come. As for table rules, I would say that even more so than usual, try to cut down on distractions. I don't like cell phones at the table, but I really don't like cell phones at the table for games like this, where mood is the key. Try to have the players stay in character as much as possible. And more importantly, tell them as much as possible to try to avoid metagaming. If they're guessing something just because it's maybe what they've seen in a movie before, that can kind of dampen the surprise for everybody else. If there's a player who's maybe prone to do something like this, maybe just tell them to jot it down. And if they've guessed the reveal or the surprise out of character, and if they're right, you'll give them a pat on the back afterward for being right but not ruining the surprise for everybody else. Now, obviously, if they're figuring things out by connecting the dots in character, that's a different story. A little joking around the table is, of course, fine to remind everyone that you're there to have a good time. But remember to just bring things back around a little quicker than usual so you don't lose the spirit of the night. I also use lighting and music to affect mood, but be careful not to dote too much on it. It may become distracting in and of itself. It should always be just there at the edges, but not overpowering. Don't deprive the players of creating their own version of things in their mind's eye. And lastly, even though it's a horror one-shot, don't be afraid to turn it on its head every once in a while. A couple of years ago, I started the night out describing a feast where a very obviously sinister man, who may have resembled Vlad Dracul, got up and began to speak in sinister tones. The players were listening raptly, perhaps expecting an orgy of blood to follow. Just then, a ghost barreled through the room, but not just any ghost. It was actually Slimer from the Ghostbusters. Needless to say, that was the horror game for that year, an old West End Ghostbusters RPG adventure that many of the players still fondly remember to this day. So in conclusion, you want this type of horror one-shot game to be special, moody, and easy to grasp. It should be something the group looks forward to whenever you decide to run it. Well, I hope you enjoyed this video. Remember to hit that like, subscribe, you know the deal. But also remember to join us every Wednesday at 7 p.m. Eastern Time for The Lair. That's our weekly live stream, which is always a great time. All right, so you guys take care.
What qualifies you to be a U.S. Senator? You have 60 seconds.
Hi, good night, everybody.